Have you ever stumbled across a piece of writing that just fundamentally challenges the way you look at the last 2,000 years of history? Well, in this explainer, we're unpacking a highly provocative document that does exactly that. We're going to neutrally examine a source text that basically takes a magnifying glass to religious history, theology, and modern geopolitical thought. It argues that Western civilization has been operating under this profound self-inflicted amnesia. And honestly, whether you're coming at this from a historical, a secular, or a theological angle, the arguments laid out here are undeniably fascinating. It is completely designed to make you rethink the bedrock of ancient hatreds and modern conflicts, and I found it incredibly intriguing to explore exactly how the author connects these ancient dots to today.
Okay, let's dive into this. The entire foundation of the author's argument rests on a forgotten warning from the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans. It's a specific warning to early non-Jewish or Gentile believers to basically not get arrogant or conceited toward the Jewish people. And the text points out this massive historical irony, right? Paul anticipated the exact arrogance that would eventually plunge Christendom into its darkest moments. The source argues that the institutional church completely forgot this warning. They started viewing the Jewish rejection of the Messiah as a permanent curse, rather than what Paul described as a temporary, sovereign mechanism of grace. The text asserts that God's promises are irrevocable, meaning they literally cannot be undone or taken back. Yet despite that, the document argues that the institutional church decided to drop the cross and pick up the sword. To understand exactly how this happened, the author uses this really striking phrase. They describe it as a second-century virus. You see, as the early church exploded in growth, waves of Gentiles flooded in, and they brought with them this latent Greco-Roman xenophobia. It was a deep cultural prejudice that despised Jewish exclusivity and their strict traditions. According to the document, second-century writers basically synthesized this secular prejudice with Christian doctrine to engineer what's called supersessionism, better known as replacement theology. This was the belief that the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem was ultimate proof that God had permanently replaced the Jewish people with the Gentile church. But here is the critical distinction the author makes. Replacement theology didn't invent anti-Semitism. No, it baptized it. It took a pre-existing cultural animus and gave it a divine sanction.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because tracing this through history, we aren't just talking about abstract theology anymore. We are talking about how theological arrogance was weaponized into imperial law. And what's really staggering is the sheer speed at which this prejudice was codified. By 325 AD, right at the Council of Nicaea, Emperor Constantine legally severed the church from its Jewish roots. The document then traces how this rapidly escalated to the 6th century Justinian Code, which officially stripped Jewish people of their civil rights. Anti-Semitism wasn't just some fringe belief anymore. It became canon law backed by the absolute might of the Roman Empire. But the text argues that this blatant disregard for the warning in Romans 11 led directly to a severe, divine consequence in the 7th century.
Now, here is where the text makes a highly controversial yet utterly fascinating historical claim. The framework presented here is that the sudden, explosive 7th century rise of Islam wasn't just a random historical event. The author views it as an objective, geopolitical cane wielded by God. The argument goes like this. Back when ancient Israel fell into idolatry, God used empires like Assyria and Babylon as a rod of discipline to humble them. Well, the source posits that when the Byzantine Empire, the very seat of Christendom, institutionalized the slaughter and persecution of the Jewish people, God applied that exact same discipline to them. Almost immediately after Christendom codified its hatred, Islamic armies swept across the map, shattering those supposedly invincible Christian strongholds. The bitter irony highlighted by the text is that the church, which persecuted Isaac's lineage, was humbled by a force claiming descent from Abraham's other son, Ishmael.
You know, what's really interesting about the aftermath of all that is you'd think a historical fracturing of that magnitude would prompt some deep reflection. But the document asserts that the church completely failed to learn its lesson. Fast forward to the 16th century, the magisterial Reformation breaks away from Rome. Now, while figures like Martin Luther reformed doctrines of salvation, the text highlights what it calls their catastrophic failure to cure that supersessionist virus. Luther's horrific later writings are actually cited as proof that the Reformed traditions just carried this 2nd century baggage right forward. The author argues this blind spot ensured that the Jewish people remained Europe's institutionalized scapegoat for centuries to come. Bringing this right into the modern era, the source unpacks what it refers to as the American anomaly.
Following the absolute horrors of the Holocaust, the United States kind of acted as this cultural firewall against anti-Semitism. But why? Well, the author attributes this largely to low church Protestant literalism and dispensationalism. Essentially, millions of Americans were reading biblical promises about Israel as literal future events, not just metaphors. And because of that, the text says there was no theological soil for that European virus to take root. However, the document makes a really bold claim here. It says this shield is now collapsing. As modern believers migrate toward other liturgical traditions, the argument is that they are unwittingly adopting that old replacement theology. The text argues that this ancient virus hasn't disappeared, it's simply mutated, returning to polite society today fully dressed in the modern vestments of social justice. Why does this hatred refuse to die? We've traced centuries of history, theology, and imperial law. We've watched this prejudice shift shapes, from Roman decrees to European scapegoating, all the way to modern geopolitical discourse. But why does this specific hatred against this specific group of people refuse to just fade away? To answer this, the text pivots entirely. It steps out of the historical timeline and moves straight into the cosmic and spiritual arguments that the author believes underlie this millennia-old conflict. To really understand the persistence of this hatred, the text dives deep into the spiritual realm, specifically zeroing in on Revelation 12. The unseen architect of this animosity, the author suggests, is the great dragon, or Satan. And his motivation? A frantic cosmic panic. The spiritual logic presented here is that Israel is the physical and legal vehicle through which the Messiah enters the world. Therefore, the dragon's ultimate strategy is erasure, pure and simple. The document frames every historical pogrom, every blood libel, and every modern campaign to dismantle the Jewish state as a desperate attempt to destroy the Jewish people. Because if that succeeds, it would render God's covenantal promises void and effectively prove God a liar. And this brilliantly illustrates what the author calls a secular inversion. It connects these massive cosmic themes straight to today's secular headlines. On one side, you have secular extremes hurling charges of genocide and war crimes at Israel, which the text identifies as the new blood libel. But on the other side, the author heavily contrasts this accusation with the reality of modern Israel's actual military tactics, things like roof knocking, dropping warning leaflets, and securing civilian evacuation corridors. The text points out this profound hypocrisy, a world that accuses Israel of genocide while simultaneously granting a total pass to adversaries whose founding charters explicitly demand the annihilation of Jews. The author argues that the victim is being accused of the exact crime the aggressor is openly attempting to commit. Whether you agree with that assessment or not, the text's goal in this section is to contrast our modern, ever-fluxing human morality with the fixed, objective biblical standards of war, specifically the ones found in Deuteronomy 20. Under this biblical framework, war is heavily restricted. It is never supposed to be the first resort. The absolute mandate is to first offer terms of peace. The author asserts that modern Israel actually fulfills this biblical mandate daily. The document claims they constantly offer terms of life and utilize extreme measures to protect civilian life, measures which, the text points out, its enemies repeatedly reject. Furthermore, the source leans heavily on the biblical law of the Rodef, or the pursuer. This is a principle stating that any individual or group actively seeking to slaughter the innocent completely forfeits their own immunity. The argument outlined here is that when an enemy intentionally embeds its military infrastructure within civilian populations, literally using their own people as human shields, they and they alone bear the total moral and biblical responsibility for the blood spilled. The author strongly contends that sparing a death cult ideology isn't compassionate at all. Rather, it's a profound cruelty to the innocent people that the cult will inevitably harm in the future. So the crucial point is understanding the deep psychological root of the world's obsession with Israel. And here, the author introduces this incredibly compelling metaphor, Israel as the mirror of Adam. The text argues that mankind's relentless finger-pointing at the Jewish state isn't actually a search for justice. It's a desperate attempt at self-justification. The idea is that when the world looks at Israel, they're actually looking at a reflection of their own rebellion and their own brokenness. The anti-Semite hates the reflection because it proves they aren't the master of their own destiny. They need Israel to be the ultimate villain. Because think about it. If Israel is guilty, the stone thrower gets to play the righteous judge, completely ignoring all of their own flaws. But despite all the heavy history and these epic cosmic battles, the closing thesis of the document is ultimately one of profound hope and restoration. By highlighting the prophetic timeline of Hosea 6:2, the physical return of the Jewish people to their ancestral land is framed as God's ultimate expression of faithfulness. The author views this as way more than just a political event.
It's presented as a visible, undeniable declaration to all of mankind. God can take what is dead, what is scattered, and what is broken, and bring it completely back to life. It's framed as the ultimate proof of a faithful God who keeps his promises, no matter how much humanity tries to interfere.
Which brings us to the author's final, resounding plea. The text calls for a total rejection of the arrogance of replacement theology and the ever-flexing morality of the modern age. It directly challenges the reader to just drop their stones and recognize the enduring faithfulness of God to the people he chose. The finger-pointing, the author says, simply must end. And it leaves us with this deeply provocative thought to ponder as we wrap up. Are we going to keep fighting the mirror, or are we finally ready to walk back home? Thank you so much for joining me as we unpacked these incredibly complex historical arguments in today's Explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.